Donald Trump is taking his toys home. Donald Trump is abandoning Ukraine, abandoning Europe, demonising Europe, throwing his lot in with Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump is Vladimir Putin's blank. There is no doubt about it. So where does that leave Europe militarily? Up a creek without a paddle. So what do? We start building paddles. And the more paddles we got, the safer we'll be. The more canoes we've got, the safer we'll be, the better it will be. And unity, cooperation, whatever you want to call it, is obviously the answer to both current and future problems. So here it goes. Here's the question I really don't know the answer to. And I hope that you can provide some illumination. Why was or would be a European army be a bad thing? Pud is in Hampton. Pud, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Yeah, we spoke before, so it's Prana Pud. We spoke before, but I want to thank you before I start, James. You made me change my mind about things, so thank you for that. So that helped me in my life. So thanks very much. But in terms of this particular question, right? Basically, the way I see it is, right, I voted Brexit, okay? The reason I voted Brexit at the time was my concerns about the Greek debt crisis. I felt the European Union was basically just a pack of financial cards, and it would all go to disaster. And also I had concerns about Le Pen in France, okay? Because I thought at some stage, you talk about the pendulum, I thought at some stage the pendulum would shift to the right in France, and she'd be in charge. What I didn't realise at the time was basically that Germany would start shifting right. But that's just the fashion, James. Everywhere at the moment in Europe, it appears to me all the big players are hurtling towards the right. So it's France, there's Germany, the big players. Already in Italy, you've got a fascist government there. And you want us to join that club. What's wrong with you? What is wrong with you, mate? I mean, you're a bright bloke.
So the reason not to have a European army to fight fascism is because there might be fascists on our side at some point in the future.
You talk about fascists on our side. Why would you want to join sides with a bunch of fascists? What's the matter with you?
But there aren't fascists in control in Germany. Many people would.
There will be soon, James.
But Vladimir Putin does fit that description pretty much perfectly. And so the idea that you don't join No, let me speak, mate.
Go on, then.
The idea that you don't join, it's all gone a bit category 1 already, hasn't it? But the idea that you don't join forces with your closest allies, your historical allies, because of a fear that they might become fascist in the future, at which point, of course, you could easily withdraw. But you don't join forces with them now to fight fascism. I have to finish the sentence, champ. You don't join forces with them now, people who aren't fascists, to fight actual fascists, because the people that aren't fascists might be fascists in the future, and therefore joining forces with them now to fight fascists would make me stupid.
There's a lot of fascists in there, in that sentence, James.
Yeah.
A lot of fascists.
A lot of logic as well, pal.
And there will be a lot of fascists in Europe.
Yeah.
So you just got to look ahead.
But I'm going to ask you the same question again. Why would you not join forces with non-fascists to fight fascists? Because they might be fascists in the future.
You know your analogy about getting.
Just answer the question, will you, Pud?
No, I'll answer the question, James.
Go on then.
Mate. Yeah.
Go on then.
No, it's only phones for a chat, mate. Don't turn nasty on me. Don't use your intellect to beat me down, mate. You can trigger me.
God forbid that I'd use my intellect to beat you down, Pud. But I think that's category 1, category 2, 0. Stu's in Plymouth. The pressure's on, Stu. What would be the problem with a European army?
James, good to speak to you again.
Likewise.
Right, personally, we've already got a European army in NATO. We work closely together with all our NATO allies. That is a European army, and it works very well. Why it works well is because we're kind of stovepipe. We still work under our own chains of command within that structure. So we work to British staff officers at British formations and above, so eventually we get to a NATO headquarters. Now, in my experience when I was serving, when we worked in joint headquarters where you had soldiers and officers from all different nations, it actually caused more problems than it solved because of national political caveats and professionalism. I'm not decrying our European allies, but
you kind of are. But you're the one with military experience. You're the one with military experience, so you are of course allowed to. But NATO has had some fairly considerable successes over the years.
It works. It does work, but from the sort. I can give you an example. There was a former. It was a kind of an experiment and never actually deployed in, but there was a NATO headquarters, divisional headquarters. So you're talking around about 20,000 troops. The subordinate brigades that made up the division were kept under their own national structure, and they worked very well. But at the divisional headquarters, it sort of just unravelled and became all political.
But this is you're phoning in to answer the question: is NATO perfect?
NATO,
and I'm not having that. I'm not having that phone in. I'm not having that phone in. I mean, NATO is imperfect. The British Army itself is imperfect. I think that if you were a victim of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Kosovo, you'd have nothing but warm words to say about NATO's intervention in the Balkans.
Exactly, and I agree, and that's why NATO is good, because it does work in that way. But if you then put the whole of the European army under a single chain of command, where there is no national caveats involved, it wouldn't be as effective. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I kind of do, but I would see it in the current terms. I'd see it just as almost we're talking about NATO without America. And I know there are lots of other countries, lots of other.
Not a bad thing, but
well, I don't think it is a bad thing, and that's why I'm confused about how it became such a powerful rhetorical device in the run-up to Brexit. I mean, if you don't call it a European army, you call it a European peacekeeping force, everybody's fine with it. You don't call it a European army, you call it a European reassurance force. You talk about pooling defence spending. I can address all of your quibbles by simply saying it'll be more like NATO than whatever it is you're worried about. Why would it have made people vote against? Also, there'd be absolutely no compulsion to join it if we'd stayed in the European Union. But because there are countries in the European Union that are pacifist, that are historically very neutral. So why was it such an effective political weapon?
Because it was playing on xenophobic issues and pandering to Project Fear and things like that. I mean, I don't agree with it at all. I totally disagree with that sentiment. But that's what it was used for. It was a weapon, weaponizing information.
Sovereignty. Is it? No one used the word sovereignty until after they'd actually voted to leave, and then when they looked at what they'd voted for, they claimed they'd voted for sovereignty all along. But the idea that I wouldn't. Do you know? I've just remembered something. I think that the idea that I'd rather be on the deck of a sinking ship, saluting a bridge full of Englishmen, than be a member of the most powerful fleet in the history of humanity, with a German and a Frenchman standing next to the Englishman on the bridge, that would offend the kind of sensibilities that you're describing. Not you, not me, no, but the people who've got a problem with the idea an Englishman should never take orders from a Frenchman, or an Englishman should never take orders from a German. I've taken orders from officers from other armies. It's part of NATO, and it's not been a problem to me. I know you. I'm talking about the people you're describing as xenophobic. I mean, how does xenophobia play in this particular space? And I think that's the answer. I would rather be on a sinking ship, saluting a bridge full of fellow Englishmen, while playing Rule Britannia sinks beneath the waves, than actually be part of an international army, an international unified union, European peacekeeping force. Philip is in Hartlepool. Philip, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, a couple of things. We lack terrible education in this country. We don't know our history. No. We barely know our own. We don't know the history of Europe. So, I mean, when France and Germany got together and said, right, let's combine our coal and steel production, and then that means we don't have the ability to wage war with each other, because it's then independently organised and things. So that leads forward to the EEC, etc., as we know. But I think it comes down to the likes of Farage, the Tory press. It's the who won the blooming war. You know, we hate the French, we hate the Germans. We're told that. We're told we hate the French and we hate the Germans. Yeah. And the idea of a Brussels, in their words, dominated by France and Germany, would then have our troops in their army was just hard to swallow. They couldn't stomach, the xenophobes couldn't stomach it, you know, the little Englanders and things. And so it was just a fantastic tool to run with. It was another reason why to get out.
It's another example of something that only works if you don't think about it too deeply and you don't really know much.
Yeah.
Because the European coal and steel community 51, was it? 52? I mean, not long, really shortly after the end of the Second World War. And it wasn't just France and Germany, although they were the biggest players. Belgium, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands were in there as well. And the idea was, I mean, is if you think of them as eggs, to return to my favourite analogy, Philip, if you think of them as eggs, then the bigger the cake and the more eggs are in it, the harder it is to unbake. And so the idea of that then splitting up and starting to bite chunks out of each other again at some unspecified point in the future moves ever further out of reach, doesn't it?
So, because the other one, the argument is that what has kept peace in Western Europe, not Europe as a whole, because obviously it was dominated by the Soviet Union on the eastern side.
Yes.
But what's kept peace in Western Europe, and the likes of Farage and Özil could say, oh, it's NATO. We don't need a European army because we've got NATO. Now, how did that work out then?
Well, he also then on a different day would blame NATO for Vladimir Putin going into Crimea, the politician he admires most in the world, going into Crimea in 2014. Would it work now? I keep referring back to something. I don't know if you've heard me mention it or if you read it yourself in The Economist. The Badgett column in The Economist couple of weeks ago posited or pointed out even that 2/3 of the people who have passed away since 2016 would have voted Brexit. And that attitude you describe, I think I have some sympathy for it. If you lost, for example, your dad in the Second World War, then you might find some of these things emotionally harder to swallow than the rest of us do. Would it work now? Looking at Putin and Ukraine in particular, the idea of much greater cooperation across the whole of Europe on a military front. Germany rearming and boasting about it is something that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago, never mind 50. Would it work now, trying to do Putin's bidding on the concept of a European army? Would the usual shills and charlatans be able to get away with it again, do you think?
Well, it still dominates the press feed.
I don't know if it does.
No, I don't. Media.
I don't know if it does. I mean, I'm looking at headlines today about UK and EU should pool defence. It doesn't seem to be accompanied by the pearl clutching and the fake patriotism that it was accompanied by 10 years ago. But neither of us know, really, do we?
I mean, there are obviously practicalities of the previous caller said about organisation and things. All I know is that when we left the EU. Putin revved up the tanks.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. And there's that famous comment from the then ambassador about having successfully brought Britain to their knees. But hey-ho, some people either unaware of it or don't care. Philip, thank you.
Actually, I think joining a European defence forum, however you want to describe it, whichever three-letter acronym you want to come up with, is actually a tremendously good idea.
It's almost obviously brilliant, or if not brilliant, then necessary, because of all the other things. The things, oddly, I didn't know that until I looked it up during the last break, that Jean-Claude Juncker was predicting as far ago as long ago as 2016. While I have you with that CV, what about objections? Here's a good one. This is from Nick, and it's nicely expressed. He just says, in the past, whenever the idea of a European army was mooted, I was sceptical. I've lived in Italy for over 20 years, and my doubts were based on my perceived quality of their military from largely anecdotal information. But I really do believe that the world has changed, and we all need to join forces.
Well, I work with, if you turn specifically to Italy, I had the pleasure of working with Italian staff officers in the Ace Rapid Reaction Corps. And also I had the pleasure of working with the Alpini Brigade from the Italians when we were in Kosovo. And not only were they outstanding soldiers, they were the only people who turned up on the battlefield and gave you an espresso, a three-course lunch, a glass of red wine, and then said, now let's go and deal with the uppity Serbs. Yeah. Now, this has real style.
Oh, wow.
They were fantastic.
And the more cooperation there is, the more rough edges and areas of friction would be rubbed away, of course. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with the military domain is that people who are outside it tend to look at it as a goldfish bowl.
Yeah.
And their ability to perceive what is the reality of that goldfish bowl is inevitably clouded by what they see on the big screens or the small screens or on social media. But the gritty day-to-day, the quotidian life of soldiers, officers, ministries of defence it's far more pragmatic than people would have you think. They do work together. They try to make things work.
Yes.
And that's the whole point. A military operation is nothing more than trying to make things work to achieve an objective. And of course, that again undermines the whole Brexit argument, because God help us, why would Britain want to help the Europeans? Because that's why we want to leave them, because we don't want to work with them, because we hate them for undisclosed reasons.
And in 2016, of course, the kind of the quislings and the shills and the charlatans who would be opposed to this idea, and you could easily argue that it hadn't quite arrived, the time of necessity hadn't arrived in 2016, they would have been saying that America are our friends, we don't need Europe. And now Donald Trump has made it categorically clear that they're not. Everything changes. Do you reckon, and this is theory rather than experience and knowledge,
Sure.
if I think you're right to suggest that just don't call it an army. To smuggle it past the heart of thinking, just don't call it an army, call it something else. Don't call it freedom of movement, call it liberty of motion, call it a European security force. Do you think the same traitorous voices would be effective now as they were in 2015? Because Putin would sponsor them. Putin would be absolutely furious about the prospect of enhanced European military cooperation. We know that.
Absolutely. And I think that, to answer your question simply, I think that there will be far fewer voices against it now. And I think that's because there is a substantial body of thinking that recognises that people like Trump and his ilk are fundamentally strategically dangerous. And therefore, if you're going to be serious about protecting the UK, which one hopes the government is, and also the citizens inside it, you have to take a much more clear-eyed and measured view about what it is you need to do to protect this country. And what you need to do to protect this country is to integrate it into a European defence force that is able to protect not only the UK mainland, but also the European continent from any acts of aggression. And if anybody honestly thinks that Putin is going to stop at Ukraine, well, I suggest they have a chat to the Estonians, the Poles and Lithuanians and get their view on it, because I can guarantee, having spoken to people in all those countries, they are looking east very worriedly. And therefore, any talk that can build on the idea of cooperative defence has got to be applauded, and also has got to be rebroadcast. It's a no-brainer.
Well, you'd have thought so. And, of course, no brains brings us back to Robert in Basildon. Or him, yes. Thank you, Anthony. Anthony there, playing up front for Category 2 callers and smashing in a hat-trick just before half-time. Theo is there. Theo is a journalist on the ground who we've spoken to a few times recently, and who's here to steer us back to the question about why the prospect of a European army, which seems like a blooming good idea in the current context, was such an effective propaganda tool for Brexit supporters just 10 short years ago. Theo, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Hello, how are you?
Hello, mate. Very well. How are you doing?
Not bad. Well, I don't know how much I have to add from your previous callers, as I agree with basically everything they said. It was an emotive issue. Sovereignty is an emotive thing that's quite easy to manipulate people with. And those doing the manipulating recognize that military integration is perhaps the greatest step a confederation like the EU can take towards becoming a full federated state, Europe, United States of Europe.
Which was another great scare tactic that was deployed during those debates.
Yeah. And, the person on the Eurasian continent who would likely hate it the most is Vladimir Putin, of course.
Well, you say, of course. Briefly, remind us why.
Why? Because he wants to reintegrate the Russian Empire. And that involves invading rather a number of EU countries.
And that means that the more effective any resistance to those ambitions, the more his plans would be frustrated or stymied. I mean, you describe it, and I know it's obvious to you, but you describe it in terms so obvious that you wonder how anybody, particularly anybody in public life in this country, could go about shilling for Vladimir Putin's imperial ambitions without realising it, if you see what I mean.
I don't know how many don't realise it.
No, nor do I. It's a question for the ages, isn't it? I've accidentally ended up on Vladimir Putin's side in a European war. I've accidentally ended up admiring Vladimir Putin more than any other leader in the world, even as he undertakes illegal invasions. While I have you, Theo, how is? I mean, we did this yesterday. but I'd be interested in your perspective on the apparent now abandonment of Ukraine by Donald Trump's administration, the cozying up to the point of alliance with the Kremlin. How is that being processed by the Ukrainian people that you're coming into contact with?
Betrayal.
Really?
I was watching on Wednesday night the very heavy attack that hit Kyiv. I saw the Patriots going up to intercept the ballistics. Every time I saw one, I thought, well, that's not going to be replaced. And then I went to the impact site where it killed, I think now the number's gone up to 12 people, including 3 children. And it was a block that Europeans the continent over would recognize. Mid-rise buildings, a park in the middle, completely civilian area. And those missiles, they have a circular error probable. That is, they will hit within about 15 to 30 meters half the time. They are accurate, and it was hit with a ballistic. So it was aimed. There's no doubt about that in my mind.
And I think the subtext of what you're saying is that speaks of an emboldened Russia.
Yeah, well, they launched 66 missiles, about 150 Shaheeds. I did the calculations. Now, these are, back of a notebook calculations, right?
Sure.
So not that accurate, but about $250 million worth of munitions on Wednesday night. While these quote-unquote negotiations are going on, thumbing his nose at Trump, and he knows he can do it. Yeah. Because all Trump's going to do is get on Truth Social and say, Vladimir, stop.
Yeah.
It's utterly meaningless.
I'm sorry that you're in a position to answer that question so comprehensively. How can people find out more about the work that you're doing while you're in Kyiv, Theo?
So I have a Substack that's Dictators v. Democrats. I do regular updates on there. I wrote and I took some photographs from the impact site on Thursday morning. And I write regular updates there, as well as writing about the war against democracy globally.
Theo Althorpe-Mullis, to give you your full name, thank you very much for calling in today. From, as you've gathered, Kyiv itself, where that I didn't know the death toll had gone up to 12. 3 children dead. The latest atrocity committed by the world leader, of course, that Nigel Farage admires most in the world.